Welcome to the Punishment in Society Digital Speaker Series. Punishment in Society is a collaborative research network, or CRN, of the Law and Society Association. You can find past DSS talks on our website. Today, we hear from Andrew M. Jefferson, who is a senior researcher at Dignity, the Danish Institute Against Torture, and the principal investigator of the project Legacies of Detention in Myanmar, 2015 to 2022. He will be discussing the unsurprising weaponization of the criminal justice system in post-coup Myanmar. At the end of the talk, we'll have some time for Q&A. You can put your question or name in the chat at any time to get a queue going, or you can raise your virtual hand during the Q&A after the talk. As a reminder, we are recording the session, so if you do not want to be on camera, please feel free to post your question in the chat. Before I turn it over to Andrew, I want to announce that our next installment of the Digital Speaker Series will be on Monday, February 27th at 1:30 Eastern Time, and feature Sarah Beth Kaufman from Trinity University. With that, I turn it over to you, Andrew.
Share my screen and get going. So thanks very much for showing up. As Ashley shared, this is a talk called The Unsurprising Weaponization of the Criminal Justice System in post-coup Myanmar. And I'm really glad to be here and to be able to share with you. I have registered here that this is a collaborative project, and it most definitely is. Just want to make this slide changed earlier. Yes. Okay, so let me give a little bit of background and introduction. Ashley already did it. I sometimes call myself a prison scholar. I have a background in psychology, but I've been doing ethnographic studies of prisons in the global south for around 20 years. I'm interested in prison practice from the inside, but also the practice of prison reform, human rights interventions in particular. And I've done a lot of work sort of reflexively criticizing the kind of interventions that we typically target at the excesses of prisons. But I'm committed to countering the excesses of prisons. And that is something I do as an academic based at an activist organization. So I'll say a little bit about Dignity. Dignity is a Danish organization, as the name suggests. And we're a rather complex organization. We began as a rehabilitation clinic for traumatized refugees. We're a human rights organization, we're a development organization, and we're a research organization. So we have these different strands. We still have the clinic here in Copenhagen. And I've actually been working here as a researcher for my whole research career, which has now spanned 22 years. So obviously you can check out our homepage if you're more interested in the programs that we run. So what I'm going to talk about, put in very crude terms, is the fact that, yes, the criminal justice system has been weaponized in the post-coup period. Almost immediately the coup began. And we shouldn't be surprised by this. We might want to be surprised by this, given that we thought maybe improvements were underway during the so-called transitional period. But in actual fact, we shouldn't be surprised, because what our study shows is that the criminal justice system was pretty flawed also during this period when one had expected some changes and some improvements. And what our study documents is the precise nature of some of the problems in the system. Not that we set out to document problems, that's not our approach. Our approach is just to try to make sense and see how prisons operate, how they work, how they're organized, how behavior is regulated and whatever. But I think our diagnosis may be partly affected by the post-coup climate, paints a pretty bleak picture of how prisons were during the so-called transitional period. So the development after the coup was no reversal at all. It was just a visibilization and an amplification of basically business as usual. So that's the clumsy version, and hopefully that argument is somehow implicit in what I'm otherwise going to share with you this evening or this afternoon. So the structure of the talk, I'm going to say a little bit about how the criminal justice system was weaponized after the coup. I'll talk a little bit about the core analytic themes of this book project, say a little bit about Myanmar for those of you who I'm presuming might not know so much. And then towards the end, I'll try to say a little bit about the way what we're calling everyday prison governance is sort of a reflection of embedded and enduring societal norms. And the two norms I pick up on particularly are norms related to social control and what I'm calling patriarchal martiality. So I hope that is going to make some sense to you. So I'll just kick off. I'd also wondered, in the context of whether this would be a fireside chat, if I could sort of just wing it and sort of go freestyle. But in the end, I got too anxious about that, so I have kind of formulated a bit of a manuscript. So hopefully it's not too dry and long-winded, but we'll see. All right. So the coup actually happened almost precisely 2 years ago, and so perhaps this talk can also be seen as a gesture of grief, or a gesture of mourning, or at least a gesture of solidarity with the people of Myanmar who have suffered inordinately since the coup 2 years ago on February the 1st. So February 1st, 2021 was a very significant day in Myanmar's recent history. It was that day that the military abruptly seized power. They detained senior figures from the National League for Democracy as they were readying themselves to be sworn into parliament for a second period, and in fact with an expanded majority. So this act of usurpation rudely interrupted what many people thought was going to be a consolidation of civilian-dominated rule. And at that point, there then began a rather bitter and intense and increasingly aggressive war over both territorial control, political authority, and essentially the right to rule. So what happened immediately with the coup was there was a declaration of a state of emergency that retooled the military regime. They called the State Administrative Council, I think that's right, SAC. And that tooled them up with powers that they did not have before. The people were having none of it, as you can see in some of these photographs from the early weeks and months after the coup. Many people took to the streets, initiating strikes and demonstrations. A civil disobedience movement was organized. The politicians who'd not been arrested took refuge in parts of the country that were already not controlled by the military, but by what are known as ethnic armed organizations. And they formed an exile government, not really exile, but an alternative government with a more inclusive orientation, actually, and a more united front than ever seen before in Myanmar politics. So the immediate aftermath of the coup saw some quite progressive moves amongst the actual legitimate government. But the military regime were extremely brutal. The criminal justice system was weaponized pretty much immediately in the interests of quashing any form of dissent. This is actually nothing very new in Myanmar, but it took most of us by surprise nevertheless. So they sacked the State Administrative Council. They turned the law and the courts and the prisons immediately, more or less, into tools of repression and domination. One of the earliest acts of the regime was to amend old laws, pass new laws, as the judicial and penal apparatus were turned against both the properly elected leaders and the people. And these new laws, they criminalized a whole range of behaviors, but basically it was about prohibiting dissent, prohibiting criticism of the regime, and trying in a rather absurd way to legislate legitimacy for the military regime. So the penal code, just to give a couple of specific examples, was adjusted. Critical statements about the coup, about the military regime, outspoken support for the civil disobedience movement was outlawed. If you encourage mutiny in the military, if you encourage disloyalty to the regime, if you say something that might demotivate a soldier. All these became criminal offenses. All these were prohibited by law, and all of these were, of course, tactics that the revolutionary resistance were trying to employ. There was also a treason provision that was expanded so that under certain circumstances, acts of protest and obstruction can result in up to 20 years of imprisonment. At the same time, detained officials, former political party leaders were charged with bogus offenses, sentenced in military-aligned courtrooms by a compromised judiciary. So critics, dissenters, protesters were arrested and detained in large numbers. This is a daily update that the Assistance Association for Political Prisoners create. They become an extremely widely cited civil society organization that for many years, also in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, were active in a base from Thailand. Then had moved their office to Yangon in Myanmar, but are now mostly back in Thailand or in safety. But they keep a record, they document who's been killed, who's been arrested, who's been detained. And you can see the figures there, 2,810 killed, 17,500 arrested, 13,500 detained. So these are examples of the way the justice system has been weaponized. There was another incident, another significant moment in Myanmar's recent history on July the 23rd last year. Maybe you saw this in the news coverage, but on that day, 4 men were executed in insane prison. This is one of the most notorious prisons in Myanmar. It's not spelled insane, but you do pronounce it insane, which is an irony in itself. So these executions were the brutal and calculated fulfillment of death sentences that were pronounced earlier in military tribunals. And this news, when it broke, was greeted by widespread international condemnation, obviously. Friends and former colleagues, other stakeholders, both national and international, shared their sense of grief and outreach on social media, often accompanied by calls on sort of the neighboring countries and especially the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, and the international community to act to somehow rein in the excesses of the military regime. So these executions were really a reanimation of the application of criminal justice procedures for repressive purposes. In a sense, a logical extension, if you will, of the regime's use of arrest and detention, interrogation, charges, sentencing, to further, again, its interest in quashing dissent, producing control and order through subjection. And despite warnings in June that they would carry out these these death sentence convictions, despite a 30-year moratorium on the death penalty, the news really did come as a shock to many observers and stakeholders, also ourselves. So as well as calling forth expressions of grief and outrage, these events beg a series of related questions. And I use these as a kind of segue into the discussion of the book manuscript. So we might ask, how come the justice system has become so malleable in the hands of the junta? How come it could be weaponized so easily, so quickly? How come the justice system serves so readily the interests of the repressive usurping regime? You know, wasn't it under reform? Wasn't it being improved by all kinds of international agencies? And how come we're so surprised by this? So this is kind of my heuristic entry point, if you like, to basically talking about our book project. Because in the study or in the book manuscript, we put forward some answers to these questions, perhaps implicitly, to be honest. But these answers are based on interviews with people who'd spent time in prison during the so-called transitional period prior to the coup. This was a period when democracy was anticipated, supposedly being consolidated, a period when reforms were really being heralded, and a period when Myanmar was seen as paradigmatic if you like, of a state in transition. It was the transitional state for maybe a period of about 10 years in actual fact. But our interviews conducted amongst people who've been in prison between 2015 and 19 paint a picture of prisons at that time, so before the coup, not after the coup, as violent, martial, bureaucratic marketplaces, paint a picture of the justice system as serving the vested interests of the ruling elite and the status quo. I mean, to punishment and society scholars, in a sense, this doesn't sound so surprising, but this is what we discovered through a series of interviews with former prisoners. So there might have been changes going on in the political sphere that granted some semblance of a democratic societal order, definitely that promised more. But a combination, I think, of institutional inertia and institutional agency rendered prisons as institutions that still fundamentally generated subjection through routinized violence. And it's in this light that the early crackdowns, the brutal events of 23rd of July, as well as the shooting of protesters or the razing of villages, are not that surprising. They're not exceptional, we're arguing, but they're a simple extension of the pre-existing norms, maybe amplified somewhat. The norms that informed the practice of prison governance and justice. The norms which are also reflections of societal norms, historical norms, that the brief period of semi-democracy did little, in fact, to disrupt. And these norms, as I mentioned, are related to social control, histories of social control, histories of martiality. So our empirical material, it provides answers to a series of questions that I will share with you here. And these become the sort of core analytic themes of the manuscript. It's about how authority is distributed and enacted within prisons. It's how power is embodied and embedded in mundane social and institutional relations within the prison. And it's about, and this is maybe the more fundamental point for today's talk, it's about how historical relations of penal duress endure even under conditions of socio-political transformation, where everybody at least is hoping that the world or the country or the society is changing for the better. Okay, so I hope you're with me so far. Great, Ashley, thanks. Okay, so those were the book's core analytic themes. As I said, it tells tales of prison life between 2015 and 2019. In contrast to the presentation today, which is maybe going to be a bit sort of summary and a bit abstract, the manuscript itself is full of quotes and stories, and really is an expression of first-person perspectives on everyday prison governance in Myanmar. But today, for the sake of, because of the format, I guess, I'm going to talk more abstractly. But a lot has actually been written about the experiences of prisoners in Myanmar, but it's always almost been about political prisoners or so-called political prisoners in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And it's often taken the form of autobiographical or biographical works, or reporting by investigative journalists or human rights agencies. So there's relatively little sort of, well, there's no real ethnographic studies of the sort of internal goings on of prisons. So we set out with our project Legacies of Detention actually to do something a bit different, to depart from this common obsession with political prisoners, to examine imprisonment in Myanmar through the eyes and words of a range of, let's say, ordinary people, whatever that means exactly. So people charged with both petty and serious offenses, people arrested in connection with land disputes, younger people, older people, men, women, and so on. And the study is based on interviews with 49 former prisoners from a handful of different prisons located in different places around the country. So in the manuscript, we foreground the voices of ordinary, formerly incarcerated people, and offer a snapshot of prison life at this very specific time in Myanmar's history, a time viewed by many as a time of opportunity, a time of change. And this brings me to my sort of country context section. Yeah, if you don't know, this is a pretty clear map, actually. Shows how Myanmar is wedged there between China, Thailand, Laos, and India and Bangladesh and the Bay of Bengal. Until 1989, it was known as Burma. It's home to around 45.5 million people. It's a fiercely diverse country comprising multiple ethnicities and linguistic groups. And I think it's the only country in the world that has experienced 70 years of uninterrupted civil strife. So war and conflict is nothing new for Myanmar, but it's spread in ways that nobody expected. So an authoritarian style of governance has been the norm since not long after independence, including a period of one-party rule from 74 to 88. And in 2011, there began a kind of democratic thaw, which was actually initiated by the military rulers themselves at that time. A democratic thaw that now is being subverted by that same military. It's also the case that for decades, Myanmar kind of shielded itself from Western interference. There's a great suspicion of foreigners, at least from the state side, the official side. At that time, they were not just shielding themselves, they were also cut off by Western-sponsored sanctions, international sanctions. And they only reluctantly opened themselves up to Western aid and influence following the catastrophe of Cyclone Nargis in 2008. You might recall that, or maybe it's vanished in history. Anyway, so that's where Myanmar is. I was fortunate enough to be able to travel a little bit just prior to the pandemic hitting off in February 2020, 21. But I was there actually, and I got to see it's a beautiful, beautiful country, and I probably never get to go there again, given the outspoken fashion or the outspoken positions I've taken in relation to the military. But who knows? But if we're to characterize Myanmar, in September 2020, just 5 months before the coup, our Denmark-based research team sat down in the office and we brainstormed a little bit about what adjectives might best describe Myanmar. And we knew Myanmar a bit, some of us more than others, but we came up with 20 somewhat overlapping terms that I put on the screen here for you to have a quick look at and get an impressionistic taste sense of how we were seeing it. A while later in March 2022, that's after the coup, I asked our Myanmar-based research team to conduct a similar exercise, and they came up with a different bunch of adjectives that are also kind of interesting. Just let you glance at those for a second. But each of these adjectives in a way captures a sort of nuance or and obviously represents a particular perspective. But together, I think they convey something of the state of Myanmar as we understood it, or as seen both from the outside and from the inside. And strangely, in fact, in the light of the coup, some of them seem rather prescient. Though all of us would admit to have been totally taken aback by the military coup. So maybe rather than prescient, the terms like on the edge or teetering or poised between, maybe they express something about the state of metamorphosis that the country was in. We borrowed this term actually from a Myanmar scholar called Renaud Egretu, he's French or Swiss or something, but working on Myanmar for many years. And like us, problematizing a little bit this idea of a sort of linear progression in terms of transitions, talking more about metamorphosis. So I suspect for him, he's probably less surprised than I was when this coup came about. So the state of change is qualified here in these adjectives by also as indeterminate. The direction of the transition, however we want to term it, is unclear. The country was seen as simultaneously violent, also beautiful, at war, but also in a state of liberation. So really open-ended description in a sense, but something that really captures the complexity of the country. Okay, jump in from that, if I may, to the structure of the book or the manuscript as it is right now. Not entirely finished, but almost, hopefully. Which might seem a little bit strange to be presenting a book manuscript that's not quite finished, but it seemed like a good opportunity to do so. So the book's driven by the narratives and first-person perspectives of former prisoners, as I mentioned, and very deliberately so. It's a relatively short book, 7 chapters organized along these lines, and I'll say a little bit about each chapter. And obviously you won't get the sort of the empirical richness of it. You get a sense of the kind of things that we are engaging with through the manuscript. So the second chapter about bureaucratic architecture is about the administration of prisons in Myanmar, with a very specific focus on bureaucracy, on rules, and on the way authority is distributed. We look specifically at the question of who runs the prison, with a focus on both the supervisory and disciplinary roles that are designated to prisoners. I'll say more about that later, actually. But also at the figure of the prison superintendent, who is a sort of haunting, mostly absent presence in the prisons. And we also, as I mentioned, I think we look at the rules, but more specifically at the various ways that rules are sort of arbitrarily enforced and inevitably broken. Chapter 3 looks at mundane survival and the exchange economies within the prison, showing very clearly how governance plays out differentially depending on prisoners' relative position in what we call hierarchies of worth or hierarchies of value. We look at temporal routines that structure prisoners' days and nights, and we look at the spatial arrangements of the group dormitories, the wards, the cells, showing how the set routines and the strict arrangements of sleeping space serve to regulate and to limit possibilities based, as I mentioned, on prisoners' perceived value. And we also look at how exchange economies based on both money, labor, and sex contribute to making prisons more or less survivable. Chapter 4 looks at the different relationships that constitute prison life in Myanmar, building on previous work that I've done about thinking about prisons as fundamentally relational institutions. The details that we analyze focus very much on the instrumentality of relationships and the debasing and sustaining dependencies that are generated inside the prison. Chapter 5 looks at the emotional infrastructure of prison landscapes and the emotional responses that prison experience evokes. And we look very specifically at the significance of fear, and how fear is constitutive of order and subjection. We explore how the way that the prisoner is rendered fear-filled. And we look at the conditions, particularly, what gives rise to these particular responses. We're more interested in that than we are in the emotions themselves, if you like. So under what conditions do people not dare to speak or not dare to act? We also look a little bit about what generates sadness, sorrow, and worry, anxiety, and even a few occasions when prisoners actually articulate happiness, or we might imagine against all the odds, a sense of freedom even. So we really try to get to grips with the different perspectives that different prisoners have on everyday life. Chapter 6 looks at power with specific reference to punishment and the disciplinary system, but also to the ubiquity of violence. And we take point of departure in the idea that power is not pre-given or intrinsic, but is produced in practice. We look at how power is exercised in everyday lived experience through the practices of punishment and discipline that are infused with violence. And we didn't set out to look for bad stuff. I know you might expect that, given that I do research in a human rights organization, that this is sort of my default position, that you go looking for deficits or problems or lack of compliance to human rights norms. But my ethnographic approach to prisons in the global south is always about trying to make sense of prisons in their own terms, or in the terms of the people who either inhabit or work in them. And this was also our aim with this project. But nevertheless, we discovered that these were pretty violent places. So then finally there's a conclusion that restates key points and looks at some of the implications of our analysis, particularly with reference to this notion of transition that I've kind of hinted is a bit of a problem, but also to the notion of political imprisonment that I think in the abstract, so the invitation for this talk, I mention, I hint that perhaps a broader understanding of political imprisonment would be in order. So what have we actually learned, and what is contained in these chapters in actual fact? So we've learned, I don't know if I have a slide on this, yes. So we've learned that Myanmar prisons are geared more to human degradation than to human flourishing, more to social life than social death than political life. We've learned that they're organized and regulated according to hierarchical martial norms featuring mundane violence, where authority is distributed diffusely, it's corporeal, it's bodily, and it's fear-inducing. And the subjection that results is brutal, endemic, and deliberate. And obviously, this is like a what do you call that? This is the condensed version, but I think it says quite a lot. It's quite a vivid characterization of what life is like. We also learned how prisoners are governed particularly through arrangements and relationships of subjugation and embodied coexistence in the shadow of fear and with the ever-present threat of violence. Okay, maybe I'm laboring that point, but you definitely get what I'm saying. So I mentioned that everyday prison governance involves the delegation of authority to selected prisoners. It involves the routinization of space and time. It involves the arrangements of worth-based economies of exchange, violent, punitive disciplinary mechanisms. And these structures and arrangements of bureaucratic institutional practice generate debasing, instrumental, dependent relationships and fear-filled emotional landscapes. And perhaps most significantly, we've shown how the everyday organization and regulation of prison life depends on a system of what Thomas Martin and I, writing about this, have called proxy governance. And this involves the explicit delegation of authority by staff to prisoners. And in Myanmar, this is slightly different to other countries where staff are not the sole actors directly involved in governance. And Sacher, who's was present, has written about this in Latin America. But we think the Myanmar story is slightly different. And we've actually written a chapter that's upcoming in a book on prison officers. So it's talk about the other prison officer, I think we call these figures. And let myself digress. So yeah, but Thomas and I, we write that this form of proxy governance is a setup where prisoners run the prison at the behest of, with the blessing of, and in cahoots with officers. Former prisoners, the interviews, they offer various justifications for this proxy governance. The most common being that it's because there are not enough staff. Others recognize the colonial origins of the practice. Remind us it's a practice with a long history. There are very few voices, if any, calling for its abolition. It's an accepted practice. It's not necessarily legitimate or just, That's not my point. It's not to excuse it, but it's naturalized. It's the way things are done. And it's tied up with the economy of the prison. It's dependent on pre-existing inequalities between prisoners who have resources and can pay and those who do not and who must serve and suffer. Survival then is contingent, and agency and volition are constrained all the way down to the most vital of human functions. And it's other people who determine when and where prisoners sleep, eat, talk, defecate, urinate, wash, work, and so on. Everything is controlled and constrained. Autonomy severely limited, temporal and spatial routines, compelling, controlling, dehumanizing. And the setup, again, it's well established, it's functional, it's firmly entrenched. Power is embedded on, I've said this a few times now, embedded in relations based on perceived value. Everyday opportunities depend absolutely on prisoners' position vis-a-vis other prisoners and their ability to negotiate and access resources. Intense emotional landscapes are generated by the debasing rules and their imposition and maintenance through practices of something called ponsan, as well as disciplinary mechanisms and the threat of violence. Ponsan is something you can read about in the Burma Jail Manual that the British colonial powers drafted. It's a practice of bodily comportment, basically. It's a form of, it's about how you sit in a way that shows respect. And there are a series of 5 or 6 different positions that you have to adopt at different times. And this is like embedded, and it's a really, really strong feature of everyday prison practice in Myanmar is the adoption of these particular positions in any, like when you're queuing for the shower or the morning count or whatever. And it's both a cognitive thing and an embodied thing. It's quite a significant feature. Okay, so about order. Former prisoners have taught us that in order, this might not surprise you either, order is fluid and contested. It always implies disorder. It's always negotiated, involving what Lorna Rhodes has called an incessant friction between, again, what Thomas Martin calls institutional exigencies and people's choices. Yeah, so this speaks to that. Everyday prison governance can be thought of as an exhausting, wearing, abrasive process between juxtaposed parties sharing a constrained habitat. And these abrasive processes, we argue, between conflicting parties variously constrained, aren't new to Myanmar. The dynamics of everyday prison governance, as we're characterizing them, resonate with and correspond to certain aspects of Myanmar's social and political history. And this is where we get to the society part of punishment and society, which is increasingly where I situate my scholarship, I think, within punishment and society studies, which is why I'm here. So to get to that theme, to get to talk about social control and patriarchal martiality, start with a quote by Ian Brown, the historian, retired now from SOAS in London, writes, "A prison regime reflects the political imperatives and societal perceptions of those who rule. It's for this reason the prison is so revealing of broader social and political structures that the distinguishing detail and direction of a prison regime can capture so effectively the ambitions, interests, and understandings of the ruling elite." I use this just to sort of, in a sense, flag this turn towards the state, but I think it's capturing something about the way Myanmar's prisons can be viewed as prisms and filters that refract social formations, as well as tell us something about the relations between the Myanmar state and its subjects, which was actually the original purpose of our Legacies research project. So my point is that the forms of penality, the organization and regulation of everyday prison life that we've documented have not, of course, sprung out of nothing, but they rest on bed. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but it rests on a bed of enduring norms and mutating practices. And there are two standout strands that are embedded in Myanmar's societal structures and discourses that are of particular relevance, we think: social control and patriarchal martiality. So starting with social control, during the 70 years of conflict in Myanmar that I mentioned, social control has been enacted through, in all sorts of ways, but through surveillance, through restrictions on mobility, through forced displacement, through detention, through torture, through imprisonment. And there's a very nice little book, actually, an accessible, fascinating account that kind of combines travel writing with social and political history. It's a book by Emma Larkin, and she makes a case that George Orwell, just to bring somebody else into the mix, George Orwell's famous novels, Burmese Days, Animal Farm, and 1984, should be understood as a trilogy of works on the depraved dynamics of authoritarianism and social control that are informed, in fact, by his time spent as an imperial police officer in British Burma. So it's not just Animal Farm and 1984 that are about authoritarianism, but also Burmese Days, and these are linked. So in an epilogue to this book, she notes how she was, quote, astounded by the resonances between Orwell's fictional account of the effects of authoritarianism in 1984 and the tales and emotions of the people she encountered while she retraced Orwell's footsteps across Myanmar in the early 2000s. There were actually not so many people from outside Myanmar in Myanmar in the early 2000s. So this is a quite nice portrayal, and she basically follows where George Orwell went when he was a British colonial police officer. Anyway, I've done some other research as part of the Legacies Project amongst former prisoners who had turned politicians. And during that research, amongst people who had often spent long time in prison during the 80s and 90s, especially the 90s, following the protests in 1988, they often situated their own specific struggles within a longer history. They often referenced in their talks with me a tradition of student protests and revolt, for example, that were typically followed by a brutal crackdown. For example, there were student union strikes in July 1962 that followed a military coup in March of that year. They resulted in a brutal crackdown, the demolition of the student union building. This was a reference for many of the people I talked to. Another was the so-called U Thant funeral crisis of December 1974. This followed the death of the revered UN Secretary General, who was a Burmese person. And at the time, the regime refused a state funeral, and this provoked student-led unrest and resulted once again in harsh reprisals, the imposition of martial law. More recently, in 2007, there was the so-called Saffron Revolution, which is named for the uncharacteristic participation of monks in the protesting the regime. This too was quashed, with dissenters being arrested, disappeared, tortured, and detained in the process. And I conducted one interview in the home of a fiery former political prisoner who'd become a politician. And our attention was drawn to framed photographs that he had on his wall of student protesters, including his nephew, in actual fact, on the streets in 2015. So these examples are just to say that social control didn't go unchallenged, yet its depth and the reach of the repressive state apparatus during those decades can't be overstated. So the brutal ruthlessness of successive crackdowns hint at the martial qualities of social control and societal governance, qualities that we've also seen evidence in the tales that we've heard from former prisoners. Which brings me to this second sort of theme of martiality, patriarchal martiality even. So Myanmar's history, it's an explicitly martial history, and this martiality, we think, is explicitly patriarchal. General Aung, who is actually the father of Aung San Suu Kyi, who you probably have heard of, is understood by many people to be the father of the nation because he was instrumental in getting the British kicked out and Myanmar's independence. But he was also the founder of the military, the same military who are now illegitimately ruling the country or trying to rule the country. So martiality is there from the very beginning, if you like. Now, martial histories are quite common. Myanmar is not the only place with a martial history of some kind, but the literature, at least what we've been able to find, exploring intersections between martiality, punishment, and social suffering is relatively rare. But we've taken some inspiration from a paper by Haley Tuchinski, who actually liked my tweet advertising this talk, and I thought, oh, maybe she will come. That'd be nice. But in a paper called Destiny Effects, she writes about martiality, the state, and punishment within the context of literal, though mostly figurative, carcerality in Kashmir Valley, also Asia. So her analysis resonates very powerfully and very disturbingly, actually, with the Myanmar context. She describes Kashmir Valley, which is a territory disputed by both India and Pakistan, as a carceral space, characterized by members of its population as, quote, an occupied zone. She's quoting people here, a bunkered territory, a garrisoned state. Let me put one of these quotes up. It's a place where practices of militarization give rise to conditions of permanent punishment and punitive containment, where forms of life are constrained, life trajectory stunted, futures foreclosed, and where even the possibility of life itself is threatened. So this is a description of Kashmir, but it could have been a description of the prisons I was describing earlier. Also present is the perilous threat of social death. So similarities between the Kashmir context and the Myanmar context, as you can see here, include the explicit display of martial power and logics, the presence of armed conflict, the fact that punitive containment isn't limited to institutions, the fact that people in general are under siege and partially immobilized. Another striking similarity is the fact that Myanmar has been in this state of what Avery Gordon has called perpetual war, talking about something else. Yeah, more or less since independency. So insurgencies and counterinsurgencies are long-standing features of the landscape. So Tuchinski's invocation of both literal and figurative carcerality acknowledges, as we do, that carcerality and penality are not limited. I mean, we know this, but are not limited to institutions. Prisons, we're suggesting, the institutional instantiation of social histories and societal dynamics that posit some members of the population as surplus and punishable. Further, as Thomas Martin and I have pointed out, Myanmar prisoners are also martial in the sense that they're run by military-controlled ministries. And this was also the case during the transitional period. The military not only had 25% of the seats in parliament automatically, but they also automatically had control of key ministries, including the one that governed prisons. So the prisons at that time were governed by a martial or a military institution. They're also sometimes spoken about by prison staff who we've interviewed and prisoners in military terms, where prisoners are constructed as potentially seditious enemies that need to be defeated. I'm not sure if this is a jump, but I wanted to say a little bit about the way power is justified. So in Myanmar, the justification of power and obedience that are often understood as what Loda and Sparks have called the fundamental political problem. This justification of power seems to be a moot point. Whilst they might be a bit obsessed with legislating legitimacy, the imperative to compel obedience and exert power seems more to rest on a sense of entitlement, a belief in an inherent right to govern, and a belief this is a belief that's long been at the heart of Myanmar's military and the Myanmar state's self-understanding. And this is a belief that reflects a martial history of social control and the influence, I think, of patriarchal norms. So just to say, not too much left now, just say a little bit about the patriarchal norms. And it seems to us that the histories of social control, the martial histories that I've been talking about, have clear affinities with patriarchal norms pertaining to domination and perhaps more clearly to protection, or equally clearly to protection. If patriarchy is about entitlement, dominance, control of territory, space, behavior, as well as presumption, imposition of will, and exploitation, what our tales from prisons have echoed these norms that have deep institutional histories, as demonstrated in a just released book called Waves of Upheaval, featuring a range of younger and more experienced scholars, edited by Elizabeth Olivius and Jenny Hedström from Sweden. And they pay specific attention to both gendered ideologies of repression and gendered practices of resistance, but show how patriarchal martiality, if you like, has a long history. So one of the most striking aspects of the Myanmar military's patriarchal mindset, aside from the violence, disregard for life, and blatant assertion of the right to rule, is their oft-invoked claim that they're in the business of protection, protecting the state, protecting the constitution, protecting the moral well-being of the people. So their aggression, they claim, is for the sake of defense. They project themselves as the last line of defense between for a presumed weak and defenseless population, unable to exercise their own will or to choose or to appropriately navigate, if you like, a pluralistic world. So in fact, patriarchal and martial norms together deny pluralism, seek to impose a limiting and singular version of the world that sustains the military's imagined hegemony. There's a report, I think I have a quote from it here. Oh, I forgot that slide, sorry about that. A report from 2014 by Safer World, from a report called Masculinities, Conflict and Peace Building. They highlight the consequence of the logic I was just talking about. Say, if a society divided into protectors and protected is understood to be the natural order of things, violence is assumed to be an inevitable feature of societies, then empowering protectors to exercise authority and use violence is assumed to be necessary, whether protectors are men or militaries. So the playback of the Myanmar Prisons Department rests on the same gendered ideology. In the extended or elaborated version of this, we examine some Twitter threads from military defectors that describe this practice of this gendered ideology. So to conclude, or to almost conclude, martial patriarchal logics and practices of social control inform the violent pursuit of order through differentiation, through subjection. The forms of differentiation and classification according to worth that I talked about at the beginning, and domination in Myanmar prisons, are embedded in Myanmar's social history, or a reflection of that social history. And these dynamics were also evidenced during the period of our study in the immobilization and forced displacement and the killing of members of the Rohingya population in Rakhine State, also evident in the decades-long attempt to tame ethnic areas and their armed organizations. Today, it's revealed in the othering by the usurping military of anybody who chooses to express or have a dissenting or critical opinion. So today, as well as the Rohingya and other ethnic minorities and armed groups, it's teachers, it's civil servants, it's lawyers, it's students, it's journalists, it's celebrities. In short, anybody who are cast as the state's enemy and thus rendered worthy of social suffering, social death, potential annihilation. So what have we ultimately shown in the study? I think we've shown how the organization and regulation of everyday life for ordinary prisoners during the time of the transitional hybrid government was an expression of historical structures of governance in Myanmar society that are today expressed in vivid and more visceral form by the military regime's war against the people through the weaponization of the criminal justice system and through more obvious methods of war, like razing villages and killing people on the streets. We've also learned that historical relations of penal duress endure even during the times of socio-political transformations, when one might, if one was naive enough or hopeful enough or optimistic enough, have expected them to be tempered or somehow disrupted. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks very much for your attention. I hope you've been able to catch something from what I've been talking about.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for that great talk. So if the audience can please join me in a virtual round of applause. Yay. So we now have some time for questions. So as a reminder, we are recording this. So if you don't want to be on camera, please feel free to post your question in the chat. And again, you can either raise your virtual hand or you can put your question in the chat, and we can get through them in order. But while we wait for people to marshal their thoughts, no pun intended, I'll go ahead and start with my, well, I have a question and a comment, of course. So my comment is, I love, like, this is another wonderful example of how this debate within the punishment society literature of like this rupture versus continuity. So, you know, because like historically we would always talk about like there's a rupture and, you know, major social change and it causes this change in punishment. And in the last couple of decades, people have been pointing out there's much more continuity, and we've been kind of debating back and forth about, you know, like, well, we see rupture, but at the same time, there's this continuity. How do we even grapple with this? And so like this has so many wonderful kind of aspects of that, where, for example, the return of the death penalty after a 30-year moratorium, like what a rupture. But at the same time, and of course, it comes right after the coup, this big social rupture or social political rupture. But at the same time, you're showing that there's this massive amount of continuity, especially over a longer historical time coming through. So I love that kind of tension in your talk. My question is just a very small one. In the slide where you showed us the pictures of the memoirs from various people, the book covers from various people, I was just kind of struck that at least two of the books seem to be written by female or female presenting authors. That in itself is just striking from a US perspective, where I think the vast majority of prison biographies are by men, in part because historically and even still now, the prison population is disproportionately male, even though the female population is growing. But then also in the context, you had mentioned that the Myanmar researchers said that gender discrimination was one of the big characteristics of the society. And then of course you mentioned the patriarchal character of the military. So I was curious if you could talk about, like, you know, were you just purposely trying to do like female and male authors for the book covers, or is it like, no, like there really is like a fairly large group, you know, proportionately speaking, of female prison authors, or is it, you know, a reflection of the prison population where it's maybe like perhaps 50-50 female and male, and, you know, some portion of non-binary and other categories. So that was something that I was really curious about. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Great observation and great question. Yeah, I've also explicitly worked a little bit with this idea of links rather than breaks, the continuity discontinuity thesis. Actually, in the work I was alluding to when I talked about the fiery former political prisoner, I have a chapter in this book. I can advertise this book called "Living with Myanmar," a product of a biannual conference called Myanmar Update that takes place in Australia. But the chapter in there is very much about exactly this thing, and I do see it more as a case of links rather than breaks. And the example I used there is, I was interested in how these former prisoners turned politicians got politicized, actually. So I wanted to hear not about their prison experience, not about their torture experience, not about the violation of human rights that they'd all suffered, but about how they got into politics in the first place, and a little bit whether prison made any difference. and then also on their attitudes to criminal justice today. But there I was really struck by how they sort of, in their narratives, they sprang over their times in prisons. Like they sprang over 9 years all of a sudden. They were talking about what happened before and what happened after, and it was like, but it wasn't a break. It wasn't a rupture. There was a continuity to the narrative, despite this sort of, what do you call that, gaping hole somehow. But yeah, so super interesting theme, definitely. But I lean towards links rather than breaks. On the gender issue, yeah, I'm sure you're asking that because of this other book that I edited that you heard about in Lisbon earlier, Gender Criminalization, Imprisonment and Human Rights. And one of the case studies we did with our collaborators was about gender and imprisonment. And I don't know if this is why I chose those 4 books necessarily, but the 2 autobiographical pieces written by women are very powerful accounts, actually. But yeah, 12% of the prison population are women in Myanmar, and that is, compared to international averages, a really huge figure. Like it's one of the highest, if not the highest, which was why we set out to look into it a little bit. We never really got a satisfactory answer or a clear answer of why does Myanmar imprison so many women. But I mean, partly it's again about histories of patriarchy and the criminalization of women's survival behavior. Yeah, so that was sort of riffing off your question a little bit, maybe not answering it exactly.
No, that's great. Thank you. Are there other questions? I have other questions I can ask, but I want to give folks in the audience a chance. Okay, so another thing I was thinking, oh, go ahead, Mark, please.
Hi, thanks for that. Hi, Andrew.
Hey.
Good to see you. Thanks for that great presentation once again. It was super interesting and incredibly topical for me because I've just come back from Myanmar. So I was in Yangon, Yangon just prior to Christmas. And so I've been, learning a little about the country, and the point that you made about it having 70 continuous years of civil war is an interesting one, because it does really question the extent to which a state can be a state when it's really never actually been constituted as a peacetime polity, which raised questions for me about, you did use reference at a few points to elites and to the sort of like power dynamics or hierarchies within society and this kind of thing. And if you were to talk about that in Denmark or in the US or the UK or Australia, we would automatically know essentially what structure of society you were referring to and how the prison is used to kind of organize that. And then really that's kind of like your punishment in society, encapsulated. But that's not at all clear to me how that would work in Myanmar when, whole areas and ethnic groups and so on have, for essentially the duration of the nation, laid outside the circle of the central state authority. So is this the Burma Buddhist majority, or what are the hierarchies which have activated society?
Yeah, no, thanks, Mark. You always frame such tricky questions. Hard to answer in a meaningful way. Also because you push me towards the more socio-political stuff that is actually not the empirical material that we work with so much, but I guess I was asking for it in some senses. I think also the references to the elite is maybe mainly in the Ian Brown quote, and the reference to hierarchies maybe more concerning the people at the bottom of the hierarchy in the prison, and those with no few resources who were sort of violated from the moment they step into the gate. So Yeah, so I mean, I totally accept the premise of your question, even though I'm trying to slip out a little bit. But I think in terms of elites generally in Myanmar, yes, the Burma majority and the sort of central plains rather than the peripheral states around the borders. The cronies, as they call them, the leaders of the big industries, and often in cahoots with the military. So again, this long history of military rule, even though that rule was not across the whole state, whatever that is, and I think you're right to problematize that notion. So yeah, the big owners of capital and the underground economies and the relationship between the military and the underground economies, the drug economies, obviously. But I don't think I can say too much meaningful about that. But that's kind of how I mean by ultimately.
Yeah, I think just my observations on it. I mean, that apparently around 60% of GDP is in the black economy, is in the underground, is in the illicit economy. And so when I guess when you think about power and hierarchy and so on, you have to actually look outside some of the traditional categories and into really very entrenched criminal networks, and as the places where wealth is kept in the society over long.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense and would seem to be a sort of parallel strand of argumentation to this argument I'm making about the transition was not all it was cracked up to be. If the illegal economy is still so dominant, if the prisons are still so bad, what was going on during this period? And I think part of it is we have to rethink the positivity and the optimism and stuff that we invest in notions like transition. But so I think your point's well made in that regard too. Thanks.
Yeah, and thanks for the great talk.
Wonderful. Other questions? So I'll throw another one in there. I was really interested in the proxy governance discussion. And I was thinking about Ian O'Donnell's recent book that just came out. And he's looking across 4 different prisons, 1 in Ethiopia, 2 in the United States, including a Texas prison where they do this kind of prison tenders, or it's something like bartenders, but it's not bartenders. But it's basically prisoners who help run the prison at the behest of the correctional officers. And then in Ethiopia, it's a similar but different situation where the prisoners kind of run the prison, but kind of with the permission of the prison kind of administrators or officials. But it's a much kind of nicer, like the Texas one, there's a lot of abuse at the hands of these tenders. Whereas in Ethiopia, it's kind of a more kind of pro-social approach. And then you would contrasted it to the situation in Latin America, and it's, there are all these formerly colonial places, and yet it's interesting to see the differences and how they kind of transpire. So I wasn't sure if you had thoughts about how this case might kind of compare to the Ethiopian case, where it's also former colonial society, also doing some form of proxy governance, I think. But at the same time, kind of coming out as a less kind of scary type prison and a more kind of happy prison to the extent that such a thing exists.
Yeah, maybe Sacha wants to kick into this debate. I think it's a super interesting topic, this idea of, I mean, it gets to the heart of how authority is distributed in prisons. And I recall, just to tell a little side story, I went to a meeting with the Red Cross in Geneva once. He used to talk about humane prisons or something strange like that. But myself and a guy called Raymond Narag, who originally comes from the Philippines, were there. We were invited as the sort of voices from the South, or voices knowing about prisons in the South. And the other people, there was a governor of this island prison in Norway was there, and there were other sort of so bigwig types, and then there was us, and they all were assuming that prison staff ran prisons, And we were kind of thinking, by the end of it, I was thinking, well, if you really look around the world and take a global perspective, it's in the minority of countries where prison staff are running prisons in the way that we expect. And this is one example of the way the sort of account of prisons in the South pushes back against the hegemonic understandings or ways of thinking about imprisonment. And my take is that there's a kind of, it's probably not non-normative, but I don't necessarily start by saying this is a bad thing. I mean, the human rights colleagues would start by saying if prison officers are not in charge and prisons are running the place, this is an outrage. And I'm not saying that bad things do not happen under these circumstances. They most definitely do. But it's interesting that it's a naturalized phenomena, if you like, in the majority of countries, whereas it's a minority that have this very clear differentiation. And maybe the differentiation is not so clear in the countries where we think it's clear either. But I don't know. We think our Myanmar case is a little bit different to some of the similar cases of this phenomenon. Like in some countries, they talk about self-governance. Or I think the way we phrase it is like in some contexts, it seems like it's prisoners that have taken control. In other cases, it's a more sort of informal, or in other cases, it's a formal delegation. In other cases, it's a more informal, fluid, okay, yeah, you're in charge and we don't really go. So there are sort of degrees of the way the authority is delegated, distributed, and degrees of diffusion, if you like, of authority. And I think that's a useful way to look at it. And so our term, we deliberately chose an alternative term to the ones that are sort of in vogue to represent these other places, because proxy seems to capture something of the, yeah, they're actually doing, and they are in cahoots with staff, and it's all about resources and bribes and petty corruption and survival of both parties, and they need each other. And yeah, sorry, rambling a little bit. What do you think, Sacha?
Well, I'm glad you just, I couldn't work out how to raise my hand on this. I'm not used to Zoom very much. Andrew, I think it shows how much research needs to be done, doesn't it? Because for me, this is it. What you're describing a situation that seems quite different to what I know in South America. And that's what really sort of struck me, you know, that you're talking about bureaucracy, but at the same time, you're kind of talking about informality. Yeah, and so I'm wondering whether the colonial element comes in here a bit as well. Yes, I think your idea of proxy governance is a really interesting term, and I certainly, in the Brazilian context, it seems to be much more organic and kind of growing out of, yeah, kind of a, whatever you want to call them, abandoned spaces. So yeah, I think we've got so much comparative research to do. What we do know is that it's different to you know, places like the UK and the United States and maybe some other parts of Western Europe, but we probably don't have to go very far east in Europe even to find, yeah, very, very complex you know, setups, and whether, you know, how much they're hierarchical coming down or how much they're just yeah, growing in that space. Well, I've got a very brief question because that really struck me so much about your talk, and I was thinking about your chapter 3 on mundane survival, because where this fits into here, because for me, when I'm trying to theorize about this organic spaces, it's coming out of the mundane survival, yeah, that I see these sort of negotiations of power happening in the prison space. So I'd be interested in knowing why you decided still to write about that, yeah, alongside what seems to be the main kind of focus. It's the main focus of the proxy governance, or, and that's why I was interested really where that comes in, a kind of mundane survival and exchange, how much that affects power dynamics in prison, or whether you're literally looking at you know, the abandoned, the people without the money, the people really are suffering, how they manage to survive.
Yeah, thanks. Lots of things there, but the book is really about, and I didn't actually explain this, though I realized throughout the talk that I was using a phrase that is actually our definition of what we call everyday prison governance, and sometimes I said everyday prison governance, and sometimes I said, quite deliberately, though you might not have realized, the organization and regulation of everyday life. That is our kind of shorthand for everyday prison governance. How is prison life organized? How is prison life regulated? And it's a kind of everyday sort of language for it. It's not too academic and sophisticated, but it emerged quite early in our study as a way of sort of thinking about, okay, this is what we're interested in. So the manuscript is about much more than proxy governance. And actually proxy governance, because we wrote a chapter on it for this book, it kind of fallen a little bit out of the book, but it's still there. One of the interesting things, to go back to the colonial, when you do a work in a country where you don't speak the language and you're engaging with your research collaborators, and suddenly you hear them using words like ponsan, and you think, oh, ponsan, when they're speaking English to you, they throw in a word that is like an emic term that they cannot translate. So there were two words that emerged very early in our discussions of the interview material. One was ponsan, this embodied subordination, subjugation thing. And the other one was the tanzi, T-A-N-Z-I. What's a tanzi? What, you said tanzi, what's that? And that is the name given to the sort of the chief prisoner, the one who is delegated the most authority on the wards. And the tanzi has his lieutenants or her lieutenants. The same applies in the women's sections. They're called discipline keepers, and then there are other people called baria, who sort of keep watch at night on the ward and permit or refuse to permit people to go to the toilet and things like that, and deal with disorder. And then there are also other prisoners who have responsibilities for work parties and for the water provision, for sanitation. So it's very specific and very well structured, and the authority is given to them, and prison staff are pretty absent, but they can kick in with their ultimate power every now and again. But these two words, ponsan and tanzi, you find them in the Burma jail manual in that form, ponsan, and you find diagrams of all these different sitting positions, and you find the term tanzi. So these are colonial creations ultimately that live on and probably have a slightly different form today, but are probably strikingly similar in terms of the way they actually use their authority, often in very violent, profit-making fashion.
Wonderful.
Yeah, just say just 1 second. Yeah, Raymond's narrative, I've read a lot of his work, and a lot of it, also is finding these terminology, same terms, it seems to be so much more integrated into the official system. And I believe from what I've read of Mahuya's work as well in India, it's quite similar, that it's even like in legislation, some of these terms. Fantastic, really interesting.
Thanks.
Awesome. Do we have any other questions? Last call, going once. Okay, so please join me in thanking Andrew for a great talk. Another virtual round of applause, yay.
Thanks for coming to each of you. I hope you all got something out of it at least. And it was actually a great experience for me to be able to talk about this stuff to an audience. So really appreciate the opportunity, and to you guys for showing up.
Thank you, awesome.
Yeah.